Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, I'm David Odo, the director of the Georgia Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome, no pun intended, to welcome you this evening. So it's my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Gregor Turk. Gregor Turk is an Atlanta-based multidisciplinary artist. He describes himself as a topophiliac, which I absolutely love, because I think this perfectly describes his passion for place, his emotional and cognitive ties to his environment. These qualities are truly palpable and resonant throughout his work. He is known for ceramic sculptures, photography, mixed media constructions, and various public art installations. Turk focuses on the fundamental qualities of mapping, the mysteriousness, inherent biases, cultural authoritativeness, and ability to simultaneously represent and distort reality. He is most interested in what that information tells us about ourselves as individuals and as a culture, not necessarily the actual geographic information. Turk received an education from both Rhodes College and Boston University, and between degrees served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Liberia, West Africa. His work has been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions at institutions such as the Museum of Contemporary Art, Georgia, Delaware Center of Contemporary Arts, ACE Art, and Downey Museum of Art. And of course, we are delighted to exhibit his work right here at the Georgia Museum of Art. In fact, we're going to be extending his exhibition here with us, and more on that at another time, but we're delighted to have his work on view here. And actually, I'll just share that I met Gregor on my very first day of work here as director at the Georgia Museum of Art. He and our exhibition team were hard at work installing the work he'll be discussing this evening. Welcome. It is an unnerving installation, I think, that at first appears literally to welcome us to the space, but in fact compels us to consider troubling issues of surveillance, voyeurism, and the line between privacy and protection. I'm delighted to bring Gregor Turk up to the stage to speak about his work. Gregor?
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here, to have my work in the lobby, but also to speak to you. So thank you for coming. I'd also like to thank David's predecessor, Bill Island, for initiating this project, and then also the Greater Athens Area Arts Council, who supplied some grant money for getting the project realized. Is that okay? So let's see. David covered a little bit of sort of the general idea that my work is about maps and mapping, but the way I sort of frame things is artists allow others to be witness to their obsessions. For my earliest memories, maps and mapping have provided a framework to understand the world around me and in turn express ideas about those surroundings by creating objects, images, and installations. So I thought I'd start today with not work of mine, but of some student work. And by student, I mean third graders. Back in the 90s, the State Arts Council and other agencies sponsored projects for artists to be teaching artists. You would go into school for a week or 3 weeks at a time. And so a way for me to get to know students coming in cold was to give them a 5-minute map. So they had, I took any maps that were on the walls away, and I said, you have 5 minutes, I want you to draw a map of the United States and put as much information in that as possible. So I think this is, Emma has a little knowledge of history, and but more importantly, she knows where to start from. Let's see. I can't quite read the name. It may only be Sally. It's a very decorative name. And she's sort of inverted the world into with Asia and North America inside the United States. This one I find quite interesting. Obviously, it's a mirror image. It's fairly accurate. It's well done. And a lot of kids will draw the idea of a map. They'll draw lines of states, but not really know which those states are. But what's an interesting flip is if you look at the compass rose, west is in the correct direction, and east is east. So my point in showing you this is that there was a way to learn about students, what their focus is, what their interest was. Maps come with an agenda, and I think it's a real important thing to understand. There can be a narrative, there could be a darker agenda, or perhaps not so dark. Probably, yeah, let's see. So, my training is in ceramics, using an earthen material to represent depictions of the earth, but I work in a variety of media, including photography, wax wool rubbings, paint, wood, and for over the past decade, rubber. Specifically used bicycle intertubes. With larger public art installations, I use additional materials including metal, stained glass panels, etched stainless steel, vinyl prints and transparencies, program light boxes, convex safety mirrors, and of course, security cameras. And David mentioned sort of what compels me about maps and mapping. And I'll just go over those again. The fundamental qualities that I see are mysteriousness, inherent biases, cultural and institutional authoritativeness, and the ability to simultaneously represent and distort reality. But it's also their absurdities that I gravitate towards. My interest is less in that geographical information as what it tells us about both us individually and collectively. Obviously, the physicality, style, and accessibility of maps have changed radically since the advent of personal computers, from primarily paper documents and bound atlases to online formats and convenient navigational apps. It's astounding how that's changed, but our lives remain intertwined with maps more than ever. I incorporate various mapping elements and principles into my work that serve to address greater issues. These include physical and political geographic features, thematic conventions, landmarks, monuments, and their depictions of symbols and in text and in imagery. For this talk, I was going to use the framework of these elements. And there's some principles in here too, mapping principles, in presenting my artwork. So we'll start with lines and grids. And to give you a sense of the extent of my interest in maps, I spent 3 years focused on the world's longest straight international border, a 1,280-mile section of the 49th parallel, which runs from Minnesota, Manitoba to the waters of the Pacific. In graduate school, I came across a satellite image of the Alberta-Montana border. And what it shows is, because of land use differences, so that diagonal line is the 49th parallel, the United States being on the southern part, wheat is subsidized, and so it shows up differently than the open cattle range in Manitoba. So this really started fascinating me. What does the actual border look like? And so I came to learn that there's a clear cut. It's called a vista. It's a 20-foot wide clearing. It's sort of like being stuck in a vantage point drawing. That's a good way to describe it. It's incredibly beautiful. So I traveled along and adjacent to the course of the border, 250 miles on foot and 1,800 miles on bike. Along the way, I interviewed individuals and later produced a documentary video that was broadcast on public television. It was 4 months of travel and then 3 years of producing artwork. So think of a power line clear cut with no power line. Clearly a political construct, but with it carries significant political resonance. So back in the 200 years ago is when diplomats sat down and drew lines on the map, and then had surveyors go out and alter the landscape to fit the map. So here you have two contrasting perspectives that I tend to align with the lower. This is back in the 1880s. This is how they built the surveying monuments, just so they could do the sight lines. And this is the way they are today. There are 912 of these boundary markers. They're called monuments. And there are two different styles. The border was actually deliberated and settled on in two different phases. So it goes from the Minnesota, Manitoba to the Rockies, and then from the Rockies to the Pacific. Some of them have been replaced with more sleeker stainless steel versions. But as I mentioned, there's 912 monuments, which means in reality, it's not a straight line. It is 911 straight lines. So the border is not straight, nor am I. The subtext of the project was my coming out. So quite beautiful, depending on your perspective. So I did a number of drawings, a couple of hundred sketches and drawings. Some were on maps. But the main focus was my Monumap series. And so you can see the trapezoid form is based on the view of the vista, that kind of very attenuated form. And so some of these were freestanding, some went on the wall, some laid down, some leaned against the wall. There were probably about 30 in all, and each represented about 40 miles along the border. So I'm remapping the border according to how I encountered it. Using different metaphors. In some cases, different materials. The piece on the right is made of wood and then wrapped with paper. Kind of pushed the idea of what a map could be. So this is a smelling map. So for this section, I collected moss and leaves and berries, and then I made a repository. And I think smell, as we all know, has very strong associations with memory. So I was trying to push that idea with what it can be in terms of a map. I pushed that idea a little bit further, and on the piece on the left, you can see the monuments that are laying down on the right, and then a bunch of the drawings in the back. But the piece on the left, again, was materials that I collected. So as I traveled, I would box stuff up. I'd put the number of the boundary marker closest to it, and I would send it back, mail it back to my address in Georgia. But what I was doing with this piece was emulating the topography with the beakers and flasks. So the Rockies are kind of there in the center. And there was also this thin gauze that had some mapped images printed on it. So kind of creating that feeling of being in the corridor, the vista, but between the map and the actual materials and actual land. I did this piece, it was cast clay of the border. I did several residencies up at the Banff Center for the Arts. And so I came back to the border and made this cast. It was meant to be completely absurd. If I had done the entire series, it would have been 1,270 miles long. So the pieces, there were, I think, about a dozen or so. It was just called 1 inch equals 1 inch. Kind of the most ridiculous map you can make. So that was 3 years of work, and so the 49th parallel defines us as American residents. The Mason-Dixon line defines us as Southerners, and then the 35th parallel in part defines us as Georgians. So that's the Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia border. Phalanx was a piece done about 5 years ago up in Handage, the center there. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's an artist residency. And it's about 600 acres of really beautiful, heavily forested land, and it abuts the North Carolina border, so that is the 35th parallel. And they commissioned me to do this piece, and it's 17 convex security mirrors right along the border. So it's a very subtle piece, you just come across it while you're hiking. And it was meant to confront you at the border. What are our fears of borders, of foreigners, of others? So again, a very subtle piece. And in this case, you can only see your reflection 4 times because it's in a straight line in the way it's spaced. So I learned a lot about this piece, and you'll see what it results in later. Latitudes is a commission at the Atlanta airport that's been out there for about 20 years now. And it is 86 feet long and about 1.5 feet high. And it is 30th through 35th parallels, but all the way around the world. So that's roughly Georgia's north and south border. And so it starts in Atlanta and terminates in Atlanta. So you're looking, the blue on the left is the Atlantic and the blue on the right is the Pacific. So you're looking from the Himalayas back towards the west. So this is ceramic. And then there were also 18 different cities that were on the same latitude Baghdad, Beirut, Kabul. We think our latitude goes through Europe, but it doesn't. It only hits Crete. It's really North Africa and much of Asia. So this is a Mokpo in Korea. So looking at grids, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I worked with rammed earth. I built cook stoves with 3 Liberian counterparts, and the technique is basically in Liberia we use termite hills. The dirt, the clay had kind of been processed somewhat, and we would add a little bit of concrete to it, and you tap it, you make a mold and tap it. So I made this piece on the Atlanta Beltline, and some of y'all may be familiar with the Beltline. It's a 22-mile pedestrian corridor and perhaps light transit as well. It's under construction right now. And so there have been a number of projects, artist projects along the Beltline, mostly temporary, by far temporary works. So this was a piece from about 12 or 13 years ago. And so it was meant to be benches. I think there were some dance performances done on it. And then my intent was for it to just dissolve. And so it's a piece about entropy. That's just a few weeks ago. So just shifting the scale. So, I'll make references on clay tablets as well. So natural frontiers, coastlines, and contour lines. Choke series. So for the last few years, I've been working on the choke series, and it is choke points are, I guess, the best way to think about it is where geographical features constrict, think straits and isthmuses and capes. And so the 9 main choke points of the world are Gibraltar, Hormuz, Van Panama, Malacca. So I did the original 9, and then I didn't stop. I did another 25. And I'm still kind of looking at these as typologies, just kind of breaking them down to very graphic, these black and white. The black is gunmetal. I think there's a connection there perhaps to petroleum. As a lot of these, like the Strait of Hormuz, 25% of all the world's oil is transported through that strait. The numbers are really pretty astounding. So I think it's like 13% of the 13% of the world's sea trade goes through there, through the Suez Canal. It's 12%. And the show that I had that featured the choke points closed 2 weeks before the 2021 canal blockage of the Evergreen, Everton. I think many of you may remember that being in the news. Gibraltar, half of the world's seaborne trade goes through Panama. This image here is 22%. Bosphorus is about 3%. And then these are some of the lesser straits and isthmuses. I did the original series, that's Gibraltar, both in clay and then rubber. I did the original series in rubber. And so it took me a while to figure it out, but clay is about, and it's pretty obvious in a way, but clay is about earth, about fixed places. Rubber is about transit, about movement, about mobility, and in between this. And so kind of working with those two materials has been rewarding in that, you can push ideas with one that you can't with another. But I've done very similar things with them. The imagery is similar, but it comes across quite different. These have shadows that don't show up in this image. They're really nice, different gray tonal aspects. This was another exhibition of the same body of work. Limits. These are based on weather fronts, typically lines that have triangles. So I did a whole bunch of kind of wormy-esque figures and sort of pushed the idea of those triangles into almost phalanges. Ruge, using bicycle inner tubes to depict contour lines of an industrial area. And those with a medical background will know, but rugae are the ridges and the folds of the wall of organs such as your stomach. So just ruching the tubes. Monuments and landmarks. The monument series. So this, from left to right, is courier, the transformer, conveyor, and the aggrandizer. So the courier opens like a case, can be easily carried around. So it kind of pushed the idea of an obelisk and marking space. By making them mobile, they can be, marked a lot more places, but they lose all meaning. So kind of an absurd idea. So I checked these out and photographed them. This is the transformer, and it has collapsible hinges so that the piece can be, and actually has wheels on one end, so the piece can actually be transported and erected. I like this piece. I was unaware of it when I took the photograph, but it says, I think it says, visit the High Museum. And this is at the High Museum. So that's how it went together. And then the aggrandizer, I think, speaks for itself. Retraction. So another project on the Beltline was looking at Paulownia, this Paulownia tree that was destined to be torn down when they were going to be building the Beltline. So the Beltline is built on old railroad tracks, basically four that kind of circumvent the city, the inner part of the city. So started doing research on Paulownias, and it's interesting that you'll find a lot of the long railways, their seed pod has a fluffiness in it, and it was used as excelsior, like for packing around fragile objects. So they would be used in crates. Sometimes those crates would break open, and then the fluff would go out, and in the fluff were the seeds, and so these Paulownia trees would pop up. The tree is considered invasive, and so I partnered with Trees Atlanta and the Atlanta Botanical Garden. And the Atlanta Botanical Garden is actually just up to the right. And I wrapped the entire tree, the 35-foot tree, with bicycle inner tubes. And so people were asking, are you trying to help the tree, or are you preserving it? And really, all I was doing was bringing attention to the tree, and with that, kind of a negative. By making it black, making it sort of a negative space. But what was important was the plaque that went with it that gave a narrative of what was going on. So the piece was up for, maybe a year and a half or so. Had sort of a dystopic feel to it. But I will say it was one of the best installations I ever did. It was in October, and being up on a crane that just had an incredible view. It was about a week of wrapping the branches. So moving on to signage, symbols, text, labels, nomenclature, misinformation. So this was the first project I did on the Beltline. And the Beltline really kind of altered people's perspectives because it was these abandoned railways that were the back doors of a lot of businesses and homes. And so as people were starting to travel that, it was quite disorienting. So I sort of pushed that idea. And so I put up what are clearly marked as misinformation signs. And I made a parallel to 4 different cities. So this one is the Windy City. And so Atlanta has a Grant Park, and of course Chicago has a Grant Park, so that's what the red dot is. And so it was sort of over-the-top descriptions of what the new landscape was going to be like once Atlanta got flooded. So Atlanta, is of course a landlocked city. I mean, it's just sort of insignificant that we're close to the Chattahoochee. The city's built on a ridge, unlike most cities. Most cities are on a body of water or a river. When I was a teenager, before I could drive a car, I was on a bike, and I would kind of look, well, I did look at maps. This is Random Valley map, and I try to find the name, find the streets that were out there. And there was this street called Tullalee Street off of, I can't read, I think Woodward Way. And I kept going in circles trying to, for I don't know, months, if not years, trying to find this thing, and I could never find the street. And it frustrated me to no end. And it wasn't until years later that I learned what a phantom street is. Does anybody know what a phantom street is? So a phantom street is intentional misinformation that is put on a map by a company such as Dragon Alley, who put in a false street so that if your map was copied, then they could prove that copyright infringement took place. But what I love about this name is, it's almost tell a lie. So that was the name of this series of misinformation. So you can see the Beltline back in its first year is very raw in a lot of places. It's just a walking path at best. So here's San Francisco, Atlanta City by the Bay, and I-85 was the Bay Bridge, and I-75 is the Golden Gate Bridge. I took it as a compliment that two of these got stolen. For New Orleans, I put the interchange of I-20 and the downtown connector right in the French Quarter, because if Atlanta was New Orleans, we would probably erect an interchange and destroy the very heart of the city. For New York, you can see it's a different scale, but that was the other thing I missed. You don't think anything about walking a mile or so in New York City. Would you walk that same distance in Atlanta? So I was trying to make a parallel of these, and where your mind would kind of flip back and forth and be in two locations at one time. So again, it was to scale, but I had to alter the roads. You can see the brown on the upper left. Those are all railroads, so I had to kind of bring them together to make a single bridge. So the Legend series, this was also part, this preceded the Atlanta Airport project that I've showed you before. I did another exhibition, but these were, we think about map symbols as relatively benign, they're sort of small, but this is where the agenda of maps really comes across, like what symbols are used. Like your landmarks are not my landmarks, so when you give directions, they're not the same way I give directions. And so just looking at some of these different symbols, and in this case I did them for the most part black and white. So like the triangles, whether they're white, red, or green, indicates whether it's a glacial summit, a volcanic summit, or just a regular summit. So then that was transferred into or commissioned when I did the Atlanta Airport project. So this was on one wall. So what you saw before with the 86-foot map, and this and the other tablets it's the perimeter wall is about 20,000 square feet, which is a really wonderful permanent exhibition space to have my work in. So if you look at the piece on the far right and then count 5 into the far right, there's kind of a A-shaped red piece. So you can see at the far left is the shape of an airfield or airport, and then on the right is sort of a radio beacon type of signal. And so those were what I was working off of. So I looked at the maps on the same latitude as the long strip map. Look at maps from India, from China, and I was looking at their symbols and then creating them how to play. So capital city, commercial airport. One interesting aspect of it was I did look at places of worship, so Shinto shrines, Hindu temples, things like that. These three are cathedral, temple, and mosque. They have Jerusalem carved in them. But the one requirement that I had from the airport in installing it was there couldn't be any hierarchy to these religious symbols. So I just had to be sensitive to that. But that was really about it. There's about 64 different symbols that I used in all. So, let's see. Monuments and markers are very similar to maps in that they carry an agenda. This is a great example. This is the Fetterman Battle in Wyoming. And this was erected in the early 1900s. And so it talks about how everyone was killed. There were no survivors. Well, there were thousands of survivors. They just happened to be Sioux Indians. So this is an example of even though the Union forces ultimately won the war, they lost this battle. And so they still got to write the history. And I'm not the first person that noticed that, because you can see the word at the very last, there were no survivors. Somebody has marked out the word no, or attempted to. So these interpretive signs I find quite interesting, and I'll go and I'll try to extract text, and so I will do that by making wax oil running. So I have what's essentially a sophisticated crayon, and I'll go around and I'll find a phrase that I want to transfer. So it's a direct rubbing onto the paper. It's pretty labor intensive. I have to often tape stuff up, often get permission or forgiveness. This was the most ambitious piece. This is about 4 feet high. I did about 13 of these in New York. And so finding just poetic phrases or odd phrases, unpretentious church, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, drugs and homelessness. There was a plaque in Tribeca that said, please don't throw food in the garden, it attracts rats. And just by putting attracts rats, or just 11 Fifth Avenue over New Jersey, can upset some people and make other people laugh. But again, I had to either, like for the Empire State Building, I had to get written permission to use their plaque. So just extracting these bits and phrases. For Atlanta falls in 4 quadrants of the topographic map. And so for the Northwest, which is the sort of gentrified, established area, very much about architecture, I used architectural terms. For the Northeast, which is where the Martin Luther King Center is, I used all phrases that relate to race. For the Southwest, where the Battle of Atlanta took place, it's all just words that deal with Sherman. So there's, hundreds of plaques out there that redundantly use Sherman. But you get some really good phrases like Sherman's monster force. I mean, that's got a little bit of agenda, I would say. And then for the airport, the Southwest is it's all prepositions. It's all about transit. It's all about mobility. So that's pretty labor intensive to go around with these plaques. You kind of have to figure out what you're going to do beforehand, but you don't know what you're doing beforehand because you don't know what's out there. So it's a kind of a catch-22. So I started thinking about cars and the names of cars and nomenclature, and these names moving around, and a comet going across. So I started making rubbings. I went around and collected the car plaques from salvage yards. And so arranging them thematically. So this is totally washed out, sorry about that. But it's a map of Gettysburg. And so looking at words or car names that deal with battle or violence. And so, you look at Commander and look at that font, goes back to the 30s probably, versus something like Charger, which is more early 2000s. Fury, which is, from the 70s. So you get these wonderful variations in style of just the fonts. This map of Nashville with all sounds. So Hummer was an exception. You don't find a Hummer in a salvage yard. You have to go to a dealer and explain what you're doing. And so I would do a few Hummers here and there, but the rest are collected from salvage yards. I set off a few car alarms early on, and I realized that was not the way to go. I would also do this on blank maps, blank pieces of paper. And so just looking at the different names. So think about this in terms of the American car market gets a lot of the cars are named after things. European market car makers tend to name them alphanumeric. Just kind of breaking that down into, the American names are the ones that, we're exposed to. So, and easy to go to a salvage yard and find. So these cover a lot of different time periods, and like the faster in the upper left, totally different font, like more blocky envoy in the bottom right. And so going from the upper left to the bottom right are more blue collar name or types of people, and then going the opposite direction is sorry, I said that wrong. It's white collar and then blue collar going the other direction. And there's a lot of assumptions being made on my part in terms of what types of people, but just kind of putting that together. But you start to see what is marketed out there. And they did the same thing with the names of places. So going from the upper left to bottom right were all European place names that were really big in the 70s and 60s, and then more rugged Western U.S. names, and all of U.S. really, Montana, Dakota, these really blocky, High Sierra, all these different names. I would also create maps with those. So this is a map of the interstate system of Atlanta, so the I-285 and the interstate system of that. And these, of course, are all the wildlife of Atlanta. This is about 10 feet high, and it's the actual plaques. I did an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Georgia, and created this map with the actual plaques. And so the outer perimeter is the direction you would go to those locations. Like Milano would be kind of south, and well, really more just east. So kind of in the general area. Aspen goes out to the west, Yukon towards the north. There you can see Granada, Cordova, Port Spain, Savannah, Rio. So this is very southwest. This was a project, I tried the same thing. I don't think this necessarily worked very well, but it was interesting to see. And this was a map of the U.S. just laid out with just the names. So here we are out west in California. Here's the entire U.S. But I'm still missing something, like Colorado's not there. But you see, like, there's a density out in California, and then also in the Northeast. During that same exhibition, which was right after the 2016 election, I did probably the most politically overt work there in the foreground, and these were called flagscapes. And so after Trump's inaugural speech about carnage, I made this piece made with steel, the carved plaques, names, asphalt, and coal. And then kind of took a Trumpian look at Mexico. And in terms of landscape, there's a sheet in the center, masonry, poultry production, and then food service with the plate. So these you kind of look down at their sort of landscape course. Pictograms have been a long focus. I think they really tell a lot as you travel. You think of them as very generic, very uniform, but they're anything but that once you start looking at them. Originally, I did rubbings of them, and that presented a little bit of a problem, especially women's restrooms. Because I had a comment, I had to know that the door wasn't going to open, because I'm not taking these to the wall, I'm just holding them up and then taking this wax oil, and then typically rub 3 colors. You'll see just a little bit of some other colors, so they mix together on the piece. So they have to be slightly raised, but occasionally the door would open, or I would tell somebody I'm just doing a rubbing, and that just did not help. So I realized I don't really need to do that, I just photographed it. But this is the restroom entry in the Jacksonville airport, and so it's the fin wall, that you walk around that blocks your view into the restroom. And so I did not create these pictograms. These are all appropriated, and so some are much more sophisticated and better designed than others. Like the center left, the kind of bowl haircut, she is from Prague. And then you look at, let's see, yeah, the one two down on the far right, and she's from Barcelona, almost wearing a tutu. So very sophisticated look. So there's everything in between. Occasionally somebody will have a neck. It's pretty rare, but you'll find a neck. Same for the men. Yeah, bottom, very bottom one, center is, I think, the only one with a neck. And some of them, like the upper two right, are so over-designed, you have to look at both the men's room and the women's room to know which is the correct. And I'm sure we've all experienced that. When I was working on that commission, I was getting ready to have some friends over for dinner, and I thought it would be fun to put some of them on the plates. I think there were 8 people that came over. And so I did 8 pictogram plates, and that was the place setting. You had to find a shop. And so it created such a response that I started doing that. So I made a set of 10 large plates and 25 smaller plates. And I was just buying IKEA plates, and then I had the decals made, and they would refine the plates and then sell them. I did have a chance to revisit the pictograms because they're so binary, and things have changed significantly since that. And so I have some trans figures in here, and I also, this is at the restrooms at the at Piedmont Park in Atlanta, and I was just asked to do this as a gift. And so these are just painted, but there's also kind of an array of colors, so going from pink to blues, and then including the trans figures. I also started matching them up with car names. And so some of them were, not threatening, I wouldn't say. But then started to bring in sexual innuendo, and that's where they became much more interesting. Horovac-weed. So that is also known as kinophobia. It's the fear of empty spaces. So on older maps, you might see sea monsters or creatures that are drawn in the vastness of the ocean, or you might just find things filled in on land areas where the cartographer didn't know what was there. So I've worked on a project for a number of years called Interstate 50. And Interstate 50 is images of blank billboards. And so I've always found them to be quite captivating. I love this one, how the shadow sort of the tree completes the tree on the right. And so for me, these are landmarks of undesirable territory. You know you're nowhere when you see a blank billboard. And they can't say for rent, because if they say for rent or for lease, they're still active commercially. Now, some of them still do have their CVS signs, but for the most part. And again, that element of entropy. This one in Brunswick that I was able to photograph over time. So there is no Interstate 50. So I claimed it, got the URL. And so the reason there's not an Interstate 50 or an Interstate 60 is the original U.S. highway system shown here in red. Highway 50 is somewhere in Kansas, I believe. And when they were doing the overlay of the interstate system in the 50s and 60s, they didn't want that confusion. So they just skipped 50 and 60 because they didn't really need it, because the country is wider than it is high. So those two highway numbers were not needed. So apparitions. So taking Interstate 50 and getting meta, having billboards of billboards. And so this was another project on development, right? And so I was able to construct on this section 5 inwardly facing billboards. And so I'm sure that created some confusion with people. Here's a new public space. Why are we subjecting people to advertising? So I wanted them to stay blank for a good period of time. The whole project lasted about just shy of 2 years. And the director did not want them to stay blank. So it was only a week or so that they were blank. So then the images of the blank billboards went up. And they were up for 6 months or so. But before the billboards were constructed, I photographed the direction of the 5 billboards before they went up. And there was a sweet spot that I took the pictures. And so I had images made and then put the images of that the billboard was going to block. And so when you were at the sweet spot, this is what happened. So the first one is about advertising, the threat of advertising and commercial space. This second incarnation was about the invisibility of billboards, that we've become so numb to them. This one, this is about 20 feet by 14 feet, the billboard is. And it was quite effective in that, with the seasonal change, it really worked quite well. And then the final one coincided with a significant event in Atlanta, historical event. And does anybody recognize those eyes? They're not Dr. T.J. Huckleberg. Anybody? Sherman. So I took, this was my photograph by Brady. So I took 5 different images of Sherman's eyes and then created his face. And I think this is sort of what took me into surveillance, interestingly enough. I heard from someone that they had overheard. This is what's so great about public art. It is out of your control. And there's no, whether somebody reads the statement or not, or I really do think signage is vitally important with public art. There was signage for this, but someone had heard that, oh yeah, they're doing this because it's just like the underground in London. If you put up a pair of eyes, people will realize that they're being watched, and you won't have as bad misbehavior. And I just thought that was great, because this piece was meant to be intimidating, and there's no question about that. But this coincided with the sesquicentennial of the Battle of Atlanta, the burning of Atlanta. And so, as somebody who grew up in the South, I was always taught, Sherman was the devil. And so this is also a way for me to revisit that. And, clearly Sherman terminated an unjust war a lot faster, got things moving the way, move beyond the age-old South. But that's not the way I was raised. People always spoke very poorly of Sherman, and still do a lot. But I was really happy with this piece, and then took it down on. It also got tagged. I'm not sure what the gold asterisk mean, but I would see photo shoots. I would come by people doing photo shoots of like fashion photo shoots. So the piece came down. And then the billboard went to this one billboard that I got from CBS, they ended up giving it to me, went to the studio and became part of a greater project that I've worked on for years. And it became this billboard. The first time I used welcome, and the second time I used welcome is out of the line here. So it was sitting on the side of my studio where the painter is, and they had asked, there was a lot of development in the neighborhood, to say the least, and they had asked, the painters asked if I wouldn't mind moving the billboard. And as soon as they moved that billboard to paint, I realized what I was going to do. And so I thought about how the neighborhood was going through radical transformation. So some of y'all may remember television went across the air, we would see Indian Head test signal at the end of the day, and then the next morning at the beginning of the day. So I was playing with that idea, and so made used soil from the area and created a billboard. So the reason it went up was because the developer was trying to not only rename he was naming his development, but he was trying to rename the neighborhood of Blandtown by calling it Westtown. And so I erected a billboard. I bought my studio 20 years ago. There were only 21 houses that were there when I bought it. This was the old, this is the other reason I used that transmission imagery. This was the old transmission, there was a transmission tower here, and it was for WERD, which was Word, the first African-American owned radio station in the country. So Blandtown is this small community west side of Atlanta. At one point, there were between 200 and 300 homes, African-American, and it had a fairly rough history. I mean, it was between railroads, slaughterhouses, and rendering plants and fertilizer plants, but it was where African-Americans primarily could own land. It also had the oldest house in the city up into the 50s, the Huff House. But what happened in the 50s was the neighborhood association was usurped by the industrialists, and there was also reason for the city of Atlanta, which was trying to expand, to disenfranchise the African American vote. And so they changed the zoning, and you could not make any improvements to your house under over 50% of the value of the house. My studio was built for $2,000, so that gives you an idea that you really couldn't do anything. So churches, there were churches, there were still several houses I mentioned. All these came down in about 2016. This was my studio when I bought it 20 years ago and renovated it. And then these are some of the transitions that I've gone through over the past 2 decades. There you can see the billboard on the side of the house. And then the other view, looking, so you still see the garden and how the sidewalk does not connect. This is looking from the back of the studio out over those same period of years. I was able to interview John Lee Green, who built the house that became my studio. He built it in the 40s, and also his son Warren. I did StoryCorps recordings and just a number of interviews with them and other people that lived in the neighborhood. The billboard was basically a middle finger to the developer. It got some attention in Atlanta Magazine, and subsequently this woman, Raina Giddens Wheeler, was doing a photo shoot at the goat farm, which is old industrial factory in Blandtown. And so she was, the photographer said, yeah, we'll do the shoot in Blandtown. And so she started doing some research. She was a PhD candidate at Georgia State, started doing research. So the long-held history of Blandtown was that a freed slave was given property by the slave owner, and that he didn't pay his rent or didn't pay taxes and lost the property within a few years. Well, she did primary research and came to find out that that freed slave actually had parents that made money during Reconstruction, enough money to buy 4 acres of land. So Bonnie and Samuel Bland made enough money. They bequeathed that property to their 5 children, and Felix Bland accumulated that property and kept it for 50 years. So those tropes of the benevolent slave owner and then the person that couldn't even afford to pay the taxes were just that, tropes. And so it's pretty interesting. So I've been doing tours of the neighborhood annually for the Land Preservation Center. In the very first year, I invited Larry Keating, who's a professor emeritus, and he used Blandtown as a case study of the disenfranchisement of African American vote and people. That's it with the white hair, and then Raymond Giddens, and then Mr. Green So we had sort of a round table. It was a really interesting conversation about Lantana. That was just prior to an exhibition I had called Reclaim, Proclaim Lantana, and that featured Rouget there on the left, but also these 21 houses footprints of called Trace. So these were the shapes of the houses that were there when I first bought the property. This is retraced using the palette of the new houses. So here you see some of the colors. I put up as many newspaper articles as I could find about Lantana. And then also the other side of the exhibition was called Proclaim. And so some of it was tongue-in-cheek, but I was asking the question, what if Lantana's name was actually used? So I took photographs of signage and then altered them. So these are all Photoshop versions of using Lantana. And created T-shirts, created kind of a logo. What was amazing was people that were living there that had gentrified the neighborhood were buying T-shirts instead of gentrifying. Honestly, took these agitprop images, kind of based on sort of Russian propaganda. It was called Red, White, and Black, and taking the prefix "re" and adding it to another word so that we had a double entendre, and asking questions about the future of the neighborhood and its past. And so the idea here was I wanted to do this as a public art piece. So retire asking, there's the Liberty Tire reprocessing plant in Lantana. Is industry going to be phased out? So I then partnered with several different organizations and then redid these on vinyl, and they were up for several months on the waterworks fence. Again, asking questions about the neighborhood. Just all different landmarks. So they made the front page of the paper, interviews on public radio, and which was really great. And so for an April Fool's joke on social media, I posted this image saying, if Lantana can be known as West Midtown, why can't Midtown be known as East Lantana? But what has happened is that developers are now using names of people from the neighborhood, but more significantly, the name is being embraced. And I gotta say, that's a really rewarding thing to now see how to the point where there's gonna be Blanetown Bites, which is gonna be a food festival that's coming out next month. There's Raina, and this is a developer that actually erected 3 historical markers. So total sea change in what's happened. We've had former residents come back, and the billboard is going to be on the cover of Raina's book that comes out later this fall. I'm going to skip over this one for sake of time, and I'm going to come into welcome. So this piece took about 7 years for it to be realized, and I really am thrilled that it was erected on David's first day of work. It kept the time better by announcing welcome. So welcome's an interesting word. It's a very gracious word, but it's got a little bit of ownership to it, right? I mean, the person that you're coming to somebody else's territory, they're the one that say welcome. I mean, I'm not trying to undermine the word too much, but there's that aspect. There's some territory that comes with it. But so for this project, obviously I was trying to be oxymoronic with the word and what the material was. But I was also making a statement about we are welcoming this technology way more than maybe we should. I mean, we're embracing it. We're embracing surveillance for the sake of safety. Is that correct? And Atlanta is one of the most surveilled cities in North America. And I find that unusual, but it's true. I mean, China's off the charts. London is, I think one of the most heavily surveilled cities outside of China. But Atlanta from North America, I just find that quite interesting. So a lot of these came from Midtown, from the Midtown Alliance, these bigger cameras. And so just the size of the material dictated how big the letters were going to be. It's not like I could make these much smaller. And so it worked out really well. So here's a great example of the shift in scale. So these are, remember playing Battleship? So this was a smaller piece that I did years ago. This spells the word warship with warships. But anyways, so Welcome, I feel, is, it needed to be at a place where people knew that there were going to be security cameras, that there's that expectation. But it's, you know, it would have been great to have this in the airport, to have it, I tried to get it at MARTA. It was shortlisted for Georgia Tech for their new security building, but I am just thrilled that it is here and the reception that it's had, and I really do appreciate that. So the last piece is the one that just went up 2 weeks ago, and this was commissioned by a church of all things, the Druid Hills Presbyterian Church on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Atlanta, directly across the street from the Majestic Diner. And so there's 33 convex security mirrors, and these are stainless steel, much better quality, because what I learned at Hamage was that the ones that I used were plastic, and bears took a liking to themselves and did a number on them. So anyways, I stepped it up a notch, and these are all stainless steel, and it's interesting to see people's responses to them. By making it curved, the piece reflects itself. So that's looking into one of the mirrors on the left, which is a really neat thing to do. So it kind of creates a Swiss cheese. Again, it's asking the question, questions about safety. It's called assembly because it's outside of a church, thinking about a congregation. But again, think about the different perspectives. As I look out to y'all, you each have a slightly different perspective of me, so it's sort of that reflection. There's just a lot going on, and I'm learning from the piece every time I visit, and just the colors of the majestic neon is just really great. So with that, I'm going to close out, and just want to say thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to show my work and to talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I don't know if you want to turn up the lights. Yes?
You take on a lot of issues in your work, geography, politics. How do you feel like your work speaks to climate change?
Early on, people were asking me, is your work environmental? Clearly, I'm trying to use repurposed materials as much as I can. The cameras were all repurposed. I didn't buy any cameras, and clearly the bicycle inner tubes are. I think that's a fair question. I can't say that I am consciously, my work speaks to that. I think it subsequently does, but it's not a direct intent. And that may not be the answer you want, but it's an honest answer. I think it's something we're still grappling with. We're trying to process. Yeah.
Hey, I'm wondering about the security cameras themselves in terms of where you had to source them from and what you needed in order to put it together the way you wanted, and just sort of what that journey was like in terms of getting them to scale like you talked about.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I started with Midtown Alliance because they the ones that monitor Midtown, and so they had those bullet cameras, the dome cameras, the ones that I made the O with. So those sort of dictated, like once I knew, like to make a letter with those, I've got to make a pretty big letter. So I started figuring that out. I started figuring out my numbers. But what the challenge was getting enough of the same types of cameras. And so the bullet cameras, which is what the W is made of, to kind of have the arms that go out, I think the most intimidating ones. So just finding enough of each one, and then at a certain point, I thought, we're all using, or a lot of people are using home cameras now, so I incorporated some of those in. But yeah, it was just a matter of also getting word out. I did a couple of announcements on my newsletter, word of mouth. I had an architect who really helped out. She had a number of projects that were either dealing with cameras coming down, it was just a matter of the timing. And some people say, oh man, I just took a punch down last week, so luck and timing, like a lot of things. Anybody else? I'm happy to stick around afterwards, so let me know if you've got a question that you want to ask out loud. Yeah.
People should know that work of his as at the Linden House in a show that
Oh,
opens on.
I totally forgot. I meant to say that when I was at, so one of the monuments is up. Thank you very much. I totally forgot. I had it in my notes and I forgot. So, yes, 3 pieces of rubber work are in rescue that Lizzie has curated and opens on the 6th, and you'll be doing a talk then. And yeah, and then it'll be out through middle of June or June 19th, I think, something like that. So yeah, at Linden House, so very convenient. Thank you for the reminder. Yeah.
I share your love for empty billboards. I started taking photos of them in the mid '80s, but they were almost like paintings to me because with the rust and the paper, and they look like Anselm Kiefer paintings is what they ended up like.
Absolutely.
So whenever I would see them,
Yeah, so to me, they're like this Cartesian plane that's blocking your view, and what that can do, what that can mean, in terms of, like, it's the section of the map missing. Yes?
How long will the work be out?
This piece?
Yes.
That's a question for David. Because I just found out today that it is going to be extended, so
Yeah,
probably
well,
it's late summer or
Yeah, late summer, early fall, but certainly through the summer.
We will be longer.
We'll be watching you. Yes?
Which terminals at the airport?
It's E, so it's E33 through E36. So when you go up, if you're coming from the main terminal, it's to the left, all the way at the end. All right, well, thanks again, and I'll be around.